Welcome to Hunter's War. My name is Hunter, and this is a podcast about the intersection of geopolitics, war, and society. Today, we're going to talk to Mateusz Mielczarek. Mateusz is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Permanent Secretariat of the Community of Democracies. He is also a research assistant at the Future Threats Lab at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. His expertise focuses on disinformation, hybrid threats, and deterrence, with a particular emphasis on NATO, Ukraine, and Russia. Let's talk to Mateusz. Mateusz, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
So today we're going to talk about Poland, your home country. We're going to talk about defense, democracy, and the future of Europe. Why are we talking about Poland? I think one of the important reasons is the center of gravity of Europe shifting to the east. I think Poland is at the center of that shift. At the same time, it has a border with Russia, with Kaliningrad. It has a border with Ukraine. It has a border with Belarus. It is the gateway or choke point, you could say, to the Baltics. So for many reasons, what happens in Poland really affects the rest of Europe. Let's start with the elections and move backwards. So I think that's an important moment. Poland recently held a presidential election. Tell me why this was such an important election and what the primary concerns of the Polish people are post-election.
Well, I would say every election is an important election. My general impression after some conversations outside of Poland is that these elections are more interesting to some colleague outside of Poland rather than for me personally. And let me tell you why. I think there is a strong bipartisan commitment to some most important aspects of foreign and defense policy, which is first and foremost strong commitment to both NATO and EU. And secondly, also very important aspect, which is our strong commitment to supporting Ukraine. And I think nothing will change in this regard. Yesterday, I believe the President-elect met with Secretary General of NATO. So I think the defense and security aspect would be also very high on the agenda. And also some ministers from the current presidential office will remain or will get back from the parliament. For instance, Marcin Przydacz, he was the former deputy minister and he was also responsible at the presidential palace for foreign affairs, especially during the first months of the full-scale invasion. So I think there would be a continuity. Also, it is important to understand how the Polish system works. The main tasks remain on the government, on the president. The system in Poland is quite mixed with special focus, let's say, on the parliament, on the government rather than president.
Yeah, I want to quickly get an understanding of the Poland's approach to security. So just from a historical perspective, Poland has a unique and sometimes tragic history in the region at the crossroads of some major powers, right? It has come in and out of existence. It has been invaded. It has been occupied. How has this shaped Poland's contemporary approach to security?
Good question. Well, definitely we have some strong understanding what Russia means and what are the potential risks. And I think this notion is quite strong. And obviously, when you are quite close or very close to the border with Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, you understand what is the challenge. And this is also the case of our colleagues from the Baltic Sea states like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and also coming to the north, Finland, for instance, right? So obviously there is this strong, to some extent, maybe still a trauma of our difficult past. And well, the situation is quite clear, right? I mean, there are no any indicators that should be treated as an argument that something has changed in the imperial policy of Kremlin. So the history taught us, definitely.
Yeah, and to look at the kind of recent version of that, you had 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, but then with 2022 and the full-scale invasion. What did that do to the Polish political system, to society? I imagine that was a shock, even though you're aware of Russian intentions in general.
Right. Apart from 2014 and 2022, there were a few other examples of Russian foreign policy, let's say, including assassinations in Europe, but also Georgia and so on. But obviously, the full-scale invasion was like I would say, final warning for Europe and also for Poland that we need to do more in terms of our defense. And if you see the numbers, actually, we are in line in terms of defense spending for many years, but definitely 2022 was sort of a milestone for us, pretty obviously a shocking moment for everyone, and a call to action basically that we need to speed up in terms of rearming Poland and spending more on defense.
And you've heeded that call, because if you look at 2024, I think you're in terms of percentage over 4% spend. 2025 is targeted to go to 4.7 maybe. Tell me more about that kind of incredible modernization and investment in security. It's something that a lot of countries talk about, but Poland has been taking the lead for a number of years in doing.
Yes, so basically we try to learn also the lessons from the current Russian aggression, modernize Polish army in the way that would be suitable to cope with potential Russian invasion in the next few years. So basically try to prepare for the next wars rather than the past one. And also we try to operate on different domains. Just to give you an example, obviously the equipment is very important and we spend quite a lot of money on this, but there's also obviously the cyber domain, and the Polish cyber command is one of the best in the NATO, and usually there are some joint trainings between the allies and we are quite high in terms of the results. And lastly, there is in terms of, let's say, national security, there are a few components, and undoubtedly the state of army is crucial. But then there is also a question about societal resilience and the readiness to cope with any kind of crisis. We can speak about it in the next few minutes. What are the risks exactly? So what is really promising, I think, is the fact that a lot of people in Poland want to attend voluntary trainings, and there are different options. So you can have a weekend with the army or even some months and then even get a rank at the end. Or you can also join, we call it the territorial brigade. So this is, well, to make it simple, this is the unit for people that still want to have their work on the daily basis, but also engage more with the army. You know, potential full-scale invasion on one of the NATO states obviously is a risk, but probably with the current ongoing war in Ukraine, it would be quite hard for Russia to start a new full-scale conflict. And also, then there is still an open question that I think Russia still has in their mind whether it is a good idea to test the NATO's cohesion. I'm a strong believer that our alliance is very strong despite some turbulences, let's say. But there are some different risks which we can observe on the daily basis, right? We have Baltic Sea and some suspicious, obviously not suspicious at all, operation of the Shadow Fleet over the pipelines or telecommunication cables. Then we have some very surprising, again, fires, and the attribution is usually quite clear. And it's Russia.
But tell me more about Poland's response to that, because there is both the kind of rearming and the modernization of the military. At the same time, there's the hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting with undersea cables, with getting people within the country to instigate fires or things like that. How is Poland viewing that hybrid side of things and making sure it's resilient to the full-scale state attack?
Right. This is, I think, a very valid question and a difficult one. I think it's quite difficult in terms of if you imagine how the infrastructure is complex and big. A part of this is under the water over Baltic Sea. Obviously, it's impossible to protect every inch of a pipeline, right? So that is why it's quite easy to conduct some malign activity there. But what we recently did, so Poland decided to close two Russian consulates because the diplomats, there's a nice diplomatic phrase for this, activity did not follow the Vienna Convention. And we also supported the idea that came from Prague, from the government of Czech Republic, to suspend the right of Russian diplomats in Europe to use the Schengen zone. So basically, our idea is to force them to be only in the country of their accreditation, because there are some information from the government that, for instance, diplomats from Czech Republic were involved in not hybrid, basically the acts of sabotage over Poland.
Then maybe back on the military side, because this is an ongoing challenge, the hybrid versus preparing for what could be at some point a full-scale invasion. I think Poland is approaching the ask to defend itself in a way that many countries are trying to emulate, right? We look at there was the emergency purchases just to move things fast, but there was also a technology transfer and making sure knowledge is getting used domestically. And then there's a huge emphasis on supporting local defense industry, right? Making sure that there is a reduced reliance on external parties. Is this successful in the eyes of kind of the Polish people at the moment? Do you see this approach changing?
Right. This is an extremely challenging task for a very, I think, simple reason. For many, many years, maybe not necessarily Poland, but in general Europe, but to some extent also in Poland, we had this notion that, the history is over to some extent at least, and we don't need to invest more, not only in the pure military assets, but one of the best examples I think is the ability to produce the gunpowder in Europe, which is still extremely low. Or another example is the production of ammunition. So there are some factories that have the capabilities to produce the ammunition with some different components, but it's very rare to find a place where you can build the ammunition from the scratch, basically, so from the beginning to the end. And this is, I think, an absolutely crucial issue to overcome over the next few months or years, because during the hypothetical war, it would be extremely difficult to rely on transfers from, I don't know, Korea, for instance, or different parts of the world, or even from the US, because we can see what is the situation in the Ukraine right now, right? I mean, it's impossible to deliver anything by air, for instance. So this is super important, and also to have the know-how on the ground. In terms of our investments, I think the biggest state-owned defense group, PGZ, will receive $663 million to make more ammunition on the ground.
Really trying to boost that domestic capacity.
Yes. And now I don't remember the numbers precisely, but it's really good to see what are the numbers in Ukraine in terms of spending on the daily basis, different types of ammunition and weapons, and then compare what are the capabilities of our European industry. And this comparison is definitely not on our side.
Do you see that being challenged a little bit with the current, if you look at NATO and you look at this kind of split approach to either European strategic autonomy and US involved kind of defense or support, do you see Poland leaning to one side?
Well, not really. And I think this is not the binary choice, right? It's not about being focused only on the European autonomy or whatever name we will use. We know what is the understanding behind it, or maybe it's worth it to redefine it, because over the years there are a few different, histories behind this term European autonomy and so on and so forth. But basically, I would argue that this is about a very simple capability, basically to be more dependent and producing key components of our army. And not only, because if we think about security in, let's say, in the more holistic way, then the question about, for instance, medical industry is also extremely crucial. And we have seen it during the COVID pandemic, how we were relying on different partners. But coming back to your question, no, I think we recently finished the presidency at the European Council. Our motto was Secure Europe. And on the other hand, I think Poland is one of the most committed country to the transatlantic relation. And it doesn't really matter for us who is in the White House, because it's also, I think, a bipartisan commitment to be involved at the very high level with anyone.
How would you judge the Polish presidency recently at the Council of Europe? They put forward that motto and the focus on security. I think there was some significant momentum around that. I would argue it contributed to the NATO summit that happened recently and the unity in thought around increased investment. But how do you see that time where Poland was kind of in the presidency of?
Right. Well, first and foremost, I think it is very important to realize that this is extremely short period of time because this is only 6 months. So you can draw some general directions and make sure that the next presidency would be somehow in line with this. And I think Denmark is also committed to security for a very obvious reason. But yes, definitely there are some achievements also in terms of security. For instance, some mechanisms to fund the rearmament of Europe has been introduced under our presidency. And I think this is quite huge achievement. So mechanisms quite similar to the one from the COVID pandemic. So to allow the EU member states to buy weapons on a better terms because we can sometimes make a deal not only as a separate country but as a group, so as a European Union.
I think if we look at relations with the European Union from, I think, the Tusk coalition in 2023, they really improved. Do you see changes to that with the new president coming in? How do you see Brussels-Warsaw relations going for the next few years?
So, as I said, I think nothing really will change. There are two main reasons why. First of all, the government is responsible for the relations with the EU. And secondly, again, I think it doesn't really matter who is in charge of power in Poland because anyway, we have to do the same. I mean, the fact that candidate XYZ wins the elections in any given country in European Union does not exclude the fact that Russia still has its own very imperialistic ambitions. The tasks are the same.
But there is a need to coordinate as Europe for that. So if we look at like Weimar Triangle of Poland, Germany, France, I think that is essential to European defense, and Poland is leading a lot of that. But how do you see the cooperation moving forward with some of the kind of key powers in Europe?
Right. So the Weimar was even extended to the format that is called Weimar Plus. So Plus is Italy, Spain, and the EU, and obviously the United Kingdom. No, I think nothing will change because it cannot. The government will be, because of the constitution, responsible for the coordination between the allies. The president obviously is an important actor within the foreign and defense policy, but more prerogatives are on the governmental side.
Then maybe to touch a bit more on Russia and Ukraine and the impact on Poland, I think, and correct me if you disagree with this, but you have, especially with the new government, growing sense of immigration and refugees, especially from Ukraine, being a challenge to Poland. It's expensive. It asks a lot of society. You have a prolonged full-scale war that costs a lot of money at a time where Poland would like to contribute and support, but also needs to rearm itself and defend itself. You have a U.S. that is promoting ideas that call into question its ability or interest in supporting Ukraine. How do you see, or how does Poland see the ongoing war with Russia and Ukraine? And what is the angle that Poland has to think about moving forward?
Quite complex question, but let me try to answer on a few different levels. I would say our support to Ukraine, it's not a challenge at all. This is not only an ethical choice, but also a very strategic one, because we support a country that fights with Russia, and the consequence is that we have more time to prepare for potential invasion. In terms of attitudes of Poles towards Ukraine or Ukrainians in Poland. Obviously, there is some Ukraine fatigue, which is, I would argue, sort of natural process in every conflict around the world. I mean, the attention at the beginning is different, and it would be different after more than 3 years. But there probably, if you look at some polls, there is some small decrease, but in general, I would say that there is nothing to worry about, and there is a very, very strong support towards both Ukraine's and Poland, and also to Ukraine as a country that fights with Russia. And we still deliver some support to Ukraine in terms of military. Obviously, we gave quite a lot at the beginning of war, but if you look, for instance, at total support expressed as GDP percent, Poland gave the most if we include both direct support and also support to refugees. We haven't seen any major shift in Europe or on the eastern flank. I know that there is a lot of discussions in the media, but I think the discussions on the media is not the best way to judge the relationship. We have a lot of contracts with the US, for instance, for the tanks, and all of them are still in place, and it would be really hard for me to imagine any major change in this regard.
And what about anticipating where the danger zones are? As you said, Russia has imperial tendencies. It's not hiding that. You have a large border with Belarus. You have a border with Kaliningrad, a little piece of Russia in Europe. Where is the focus going? Is it thinking about those border zones, which I know have been significantly increased in terms of protection? What is the approach to the threat that Russia poses to the territory of Poland?
If I may go back for a second to your previous question, because I think, and also recalls with the European autonomy, obviously we really rely on our strategic partnership with the US, but also I have to say a few positive words about our European allies. For instance, Norway will deploy a F-35 to Poland. German Patriots are in Rzeszów, where is the main logistic hub that is super crucial in terms of supporting Ukraine, because most of the aid or some military equipment goes through Rzeszów to Ukraine. So this is also an important aspect. I think that we have more cooperation at the European level. And coming back to your question about the threat assessment, obviously the landscape is quite well known for everyone in this field, but I think I would make a point regarding Belarus, because obviously we have this open question whether there will be some real negotiation process between Ukraine and Russia and so on and so forth. But I think sometimes we forget about Belarus, and recently there was quite important, I think, a visit of General Kellogg to Minsk. He met with Lukashenko. One of the results was that 3 Poles has been released, as well as Cichanowski. So for the context, he was the candidate in the fraud elections many years ago, and then he had been arrested and was a political prisoner. So I think the question about the future of Belarus is quite important for a few different reasons. From the Polish perspective, strategic perspective, we have quite a long border with Belarus. So this is obviously a challenge. And the main question, I think, is about the level of dependency Belarus on Russia. And the question, obviously, the cooperation between Minsk and Moscow is extremely close and is getting closer. But I think we should try to avoid as far as we can avoid the full integration of these two countries. Basically, it would be bad if we fully lose Belarus and there will be only Russia in this place.
Some argue it has already happened.
Right. To some extent, definitely. Well, the tendency is quite clear, right? But then if you look at the Belarusian cooperation with Russia on war in Ukraine, then obviously Belarus gave Russia the territory at the beginning. But I think that there is still some hesitance to really move on and join Russia in this regard. Because if you look at the timeline, after allowing Russia to attack Ukraine at the beginning from Belarus, then the situation is quite, I'm not sure whether calm is a good word, but definitely there are some doubts, I think, in Minsk.
Yes, I think maybe my question is, does that matter? If Putin wants to use Belarus as a staging ground for an invasion like he did with Ukraine, is there anything stopping him from doing it in a way that might not be clear to us, because it's, there's the physical part of stationing troops, but that's already happened. So I think the worry is it could have already happened or is in the making, even if Minsk says, we would rather stay slightly independent.
Yes, so I don't know the answer to this question, because the question is how much power Lukashenko still has and what would be the attitude of the military in Belarus. Obviously, there is also a very strong connection between Russian and Belarusian army. But my point is that we should try, if we still can, to try to avoid the situation when there is no such a question at all. But
yeah. I want to kind of get to the Polish leadership in Europe toward the end, but before I get to that, what am I forgetting to ask about Poland and defense? How are you looking at, what are the topics that I'm forgetting to cover that are important for our understanding of Poland in this moment where Europe is really only focused on security and defense against Russia?
Interesting question. I think it's good to sometimes imagine the situation, let's say post-war. Obviously, it wouldn't be a post-war, but some pause, most likely. And imagine the attitude of Europe towards Russia after some months of, let's say, hypothetical stabilization in Ukraine and no fights there. So I'm still a bit worried about this notion of business as usual. I think is weaker than it was a few years ago, but I think we should still remember quite vividly what has happened over the last 3 years and finally try to learn something from history and understand that Russia is not our partner and does not express any willingness to become a partner on an equal basis. And the last thing we should think about it is going back to business as usual.
Which we did after 2014, no? There was
Well, the question is whether we really finished after 2014. I think one of the biggest mistakes of, let's say, the collective West was the fact that this violation of international law, right, was largely, I don't know, forgotten or something like that by the West.
Maybe then to kind of end on Polish leadership, there's talk of wanting a more Polish Europe, right? And I think the presidency recently showed that, where Poland has priorities on strengthening democracy, internal divisions aside. It's really been making incredible amount of progress on the democracy side. It is putting defense first, but in a way that both develops, encourages, and grows the economy, right? So you're not outsourcing everything. You're really using defense as a way to lift up the society. How do we get a more Polish Europe, and what role do you see Poland playing in the future of leadership in the European Union?
So let me share with you an interesting statistics that's shown something very interesting over the last few years. I recently saw Alex Tapp's comparison, and he found out that Poland went from Iran level of economic development to Japan level in a single generation in terms of GDP. And it's worth adding that unfortunately Poland has no access to gas and oil, and Iran does. But I think we have a strong attachment to freedom, and that's why it happened.
And you see it continuing.
Oh, yes, and I hope we'll see it over the next few years as well.
Perfect. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Mateusz, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much.